On the line with us, our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff. He is the economist and co-founder of Democracy at Work, the author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. His website, democracyatwork.info, also rdwolff with two Fs.com. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, as in Professor Wolff, with two Fs, or at democracy at WRK. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
It's great having you with us. Brexit is at the top of the headlines right now, and I wanted to get your thoughts on what's going on there, where it came from, where it's going. Is the EU a neoliberal experiment or not? And also, I'm hearing, in fact, I heard it yesterday on, I believe it was France 24, that a lot of the people who are participating in the Yellow Vest movement are saying time to withdraw from the EU. That sentiment is growing across France, and I'm wondering your thoughts on that whole constellation of stuff.
Well, I think it's a remarkable development. I think the Yellow Jackets in France represent, I'll go out on a limb, a historic emergence of the mass of people back into active political engagement. It's absolutely extraordinary, I think, for anybody who takes democracy seriously. But take a step back. What all of this is, what you point to in the polls in France, the whole Brexit story, is a kind of delayed reaction of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Europeans to the crash of 2008. I'll overstate it, but I'll say roughly that you might think of what happened in Europe afterwards as having something like the famous deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming car, frozen, even though the animal understands it has to get out of the way. The French people, the British people, thought that the economic downturn of 2008 would not last too long. They were wrong. They hoped they'd get through it without suffering. They were wrong. They hoped that, like after the Great Depression of the 30s, the inequality of the society would be seen as a problem and would be reversed, and they were wrong. It took years to kind of beat out those hopeful expectations, and so then we get to a couple of years ago, and you begin to see the real massive shift of the European population, and they're trying to figure out what went wrong here. What is the problem? They were not prepared, although they are now. They were not prepared 2 or 3 years ago to be critical of capitalism as an economic system. They were looking for easier problems to solve, simpler problems to solve. And so some of them got drawn into really, in retrospect, crazy ideas you latch on to because you're afraid of dealing with the real problem, and you hope that this easier to solve problem will get you out of the fix. So the British, for example, decided in large numbers that their problem was being part of Europe. Frankly, as an economist and everything else, that's crazy. And everything that has happened in Britain since that time shows how crazy this is. The country is ripped apart by those who want to leave and those who want to stay. The governing party of the Tories is literally in free fall of disintegration. The mass of British people's situation does not get better. It gets worse. The uncertainty, it's a craziness. You saw the same kind of craziness in many European countries, as you did here in the United States, where the upset about the crisis, the upset about the bailouts of the very big banks who brought us the crisis, and then using the money that the state borrowed to bail out the banks as the excuse for why we have a bad deficit and therefore we have to have austerity for the mass of people. It really is too much. And so Europeans decided, again, this is crazy, that immigrants were their problem, just like we had here in the United States. That these people coming into this part of the world, usually desperate, usually refugees, usually hounded by war as well as economic limit, are somehow the problem, and if we stop the invasion, well, then our problems will be solved. It doesn't work. It has nothing to do with it, but you're seeing the kind of play before the play. It's the last gasp of folks who know there's a serious problem, who've avoided facing that it lies right in the core of the economic system, and they're trying to find some other way out. Having said all of that, I think the French Yellow Jacket movement is, in fact, the antidote. It is a movement that is not focused on immigrants, is not focused on hardly any of the distractions. You're right. The notion that somehow being part of the EU, because that's something that changed over the last short period of time, is the root of their problem. But that'll dissipate pretty quick, because mostly what the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Jackets, are about is demanding economic change to no longer suffer the declining job security, the loss of benefits, the reduced public services, the scarcity of good jobs, the very things that everybody is suffering for the last 10 years, that those are the issues. They have to be addressed directly, and if the political party system can't do it, well, then the people will go into the streets with their yellow jackets and make the changes happen. I really think we're at a very nodal point of change in modern history.
I heard Andrew Sullivan yesterday speaking to this, basically speaking on behalf of Brexit, or at least rationalizing it, pointing out that and I haven't been able to validate these numbers. It seems like it might be hyperbolic, but that from the time that basically the UK joining the European Union erased the borders, right? And so anybody in the European Union, any citizen of any country in the EU, could emigrate to England, and England was a very, very wealthy nation, and there's a lot of really, really poor nations in the EU, particularly as they absorb things like Poland and Hungary and whatnot, and
right.
and so you've got this Polish plumber, these ads that the right wing was using in the UK to point out that in fact wages have been driven down by immigration, and his point was that more people immigrated into the UK from the time the UK joined the EU to today than immigrated into the UK from the Norman invasion to the time of the forming of the EU, that it was that radical a change. There's something like a 30% increase in the population of Great Britain during this period of time, and the consequence of that was that it drove down wages substantially, and that's what people are reacting to. Is he wrong?
No, he's got, as usual, he's got his finger on something that is real, but he's hyping the significance. Look, there are benefits when you bring in cheap labor. The fact of the matter is, every time you had a plumber coming from Poland, you had someone willing to work with high skills at a fraction of the price of a British laborer. This is a real problem for the British laborer, absolutely. But the initiative for it and the goals lying behind it are profit. You are squeezing the working class, and you're making the rich, the employer class, richer. There's no question that raises all kinds of problems. But the problem is a system that works this way rather than picking up on the detail that it's a Polish plumber rather than somebody else. In a different society, you would say either you can't come in, or if you're going to let these people come in, then you have to do something to guarantee the livelihoods of the people who were here before, as well as accommodating the influx of those who want to come. Every effort at union, including that here in the United States, brought together richer areas and poorer areas. And the poor tend to leave the areas they're in to go to the richer areas if they can, because it makes their lives better. We used to celebrate that the country, the United States, which for a long time was the major welcomer of poorer people willing to work for less money into the United States, was a crucial part of building up our economic system. That's because we had work for them to do. That's because we provided jobs and housing and so on. If you didn't, then you would have had the backlash that you have in Europe. But the problem is not that we can't find work for people to do. Britain is an old country desperately in need of rebuilding its cities, its housing, not even to speak of a Green New Deal in order to deal with the ecological problems. There's more than enough work for the local people and for the immigrants. And remember, the immigration is usually temporary. After a while, and by the way, that has happened in the case of Poland, very dramatically in the last 5 years, those people are Polish, and in large numbers go back from England after they've earned some money to live in Poland because it's much cheaper and to be part of the society they grew up in. So I think if you understood this more in the historical context, you wouldn't make these alarmist kind of notions, oh my God, we have an invasion. It's really no more true of Britain and Polish plumbers than it is of America and Honduran coffee farmers.
Yeah, yeah. So what, we just have a minute to a hard break here. What is the solution? How do we solve it?
Well, I think it's a very old idea. If you want to have a peaceful society, you've got to give people decent work at decent income. The British have failed to do that for their own people long before they joined the EU. This is an old problem in England and has roiled British politics for at least the last 2 centuries. There is nothing new here. If you want social peace, if you want to treat people in a way that will make them peaceful and good with each other, then don't give some of them a job at high income, other people no job at all, or a job with no security and no benefits. And if you're going to become part of the European Union, which the British chose to do, and you're going to accept people coming into your country because they're looking for work, and if you don't want that to produce a political cataclysm, then you have to make sure that they don't come in as competitors for insufficient jobs. You have to provide work for everybody. And everyone in the British elite knows that. But they chose to put profits ahead of that, and now they reap the whirlwind that results.
Remarkable. Professor Richard Wolff, thank you so much for dropping by.